Cool, right. It's 11 o'clock, so let's get started. A very warm welcome, everybody. And this has proven to be a particularly curiosity-generating topic, hybrid. I mean, both Fiona and I have been at a number of conferences over the last couple of weeks, virtual, of course. And there was pretty much no other conversation about hybrid models, hybrid policies, talking about what hybrid looks like for different kinds of businesses, different kinds of teams. So we wanted to put together a webinar that allows us to draw on the power and the knowledge and the experience of our amazing international network to have a deeper conversation about this and share some of our own thinking around what hybrid looks like. And we'll get into how we're going to do that very shortly. Just before we do that, a little some hellos that are coming in on the chat box. Hello to Diane from Red Sky, and to Lisa, who's just back from a hybrid team event in Cambridge. Looking forward to hearing more about that, Lisa. And to Matt, who's in Portugal. Wonderful. And I hope you're making the most of that sun and warmth. So my name's Mark. For those of you who've not met me before, I think many of you I will have met on your accreditations many moons ago. I have a sort of multiple hats at TMS. I still do get involved in some of the accreditations. I'm a team facilitator, I'm an accredited coach and mentor, but officially my hat is as managing director of the business. And it's been 17 years that I've been working with the amazing team here at TMSDI. It's a great pleasure. And you know, like all teams, we're also in this boat of figuring out, what does hybrid look like? Has our thinking, have our expectations evolved over what we want hybrid to be for our team? So we're kind of living this along with everybody else, and I'm happy to share some of our thoughts and perspectives on that as we go through the session. And I'm joined today by my wonderful colleague Fiona. Hi, Fiona.
Hello, and hello to everyone that's joined and people that are joining as I'm talking. So I work with Mark at TMSDI, and I have a few hats as well. I do quite a lot of our accreditations here at TMSDI, and I also facilitate team workshops, and I do coaching, and I have a background in consultancy, having worked in the public and private sector during my career. So I'm really interested and delighted to be here. I've been talking to clients and working with people on hybrid working and delivering virtual workshops in this space, but also I have been delivering some face-to-face following COVID guidelines, of course, for teams who are coming back to the office, but maybe, you know, one day a week, and then they're going to be in the office one day a week and then working remotely. So to kickstart this new way of working, I've been running some workshops for them as well. So it's been really interesting to, as Mark said, for us to be going through it, of course, but also working with others and working with their requirements and learning more about that. So, so really good to be here, and look forward to having some really good conversations.
Thanks, Fiona. And in terms of our expectations for today, how we are wanting to involve people, this is a slightly new format of a webinar, and we wanted to make it conversational based rather than having an expert speaker coming along and sharing their story or sharing their tips and models. We wanted to draw on the kind of unified experience of who's in the room, and we're going to be doing that via a number of methods. So first of all, we've already seen some of this happening in the chat box. So if you've got any questions, comments, concerns, feedback, pop that straight into the chat box, and we'll be pausing momentarily throughout the session to visit that that chat and consider any comments together. Likewise, if you want to use the Q&A box, if you have a particular question you want either myself and Fiona to consider, or maybe some of the other attendees on the line to consider, you can add that there. You can also look at what other people have asked in the question box, and you can upvote questions. So if you see something that you'd really like to see the answer to, or you'd like to see discussed, hit the upvote button, and that will rise to the top of the pile, and it's more likely that we'll have time to spend some time exploring that one in the time that we have available today. Likewise, we should be able to get into some breakout groups. So we've got quite a few people on the line today, and we want to make sure that people have their say, and you've got an opportunity to share as well as receive. So we'll be moving into some great breakout groups with some discussion prompts shortly. And then likewise, just building on what Mary Frances was saying from Glasgow, if you have something that you wanted to contribute at any point, raise your hand using the icon on the control panel, and we'll just bring you in so that you can have your say, and we'll allow you to unmute your mic and even unlock your webcam if you wanted to do that, if you're comfortable doing that. And yeah, we wanted this to be a genuine conversational piece. Okay, hopefully that's nice and clear. The idea behind this webinar is kind of fourfold. First of all, we wanted you to be able to hear from other members of the network. As we can see from the chat box, we've got an amazing international group joining today, and we're really thrilled to have some of our most experienced, long-standing facilitators who've been using the profiles for 25 plus years. Some people who are very newly accredited as well. So we've got a real breadth of experience in the room with us, and an opportunity for you to share your own perspectives and any questions that you might have about this with other people from your peers from the learning and development industry. And the idea behind all of that is to boost your confidence. So you hopefully will come away with this with some new ideas, new phrases, new models, ways of thinking about this very new way of working together and considering the space that we work in particular. Now, one of the things I wanted to suggest that we would happily take away and work on afterwards is that if you come across any really useful resources that relate to hybrid working, whether it's an article, we've got some really great blog pieces that we've been reading from the network, which we'll put straight into this piece. Maybe it's a video, maybe it's a podcast, maybe it's another type of media that you've come across that you found really helpful. Please do pop that into the chat box. And what Fiona and I will do afterwards is we'll pull all that together as a curation piece and make sure it's shared with everybody who's attended after the session, so that you can have access to those as you need to. Hopefully that's okay. And feel free to post as many or as few or as little as you like. Okay. Anything else from you, Fiona, before we get into these?
No, I think you've covered everything there. That's great.
Wonderful,
yeah.
wonderful. So we're going to start off with our first breakout, and I'm just going to stop sharing while we do this. And I'm going to move everybody into rooms. So we've got 34 people on the line just now. And while we do this, we'll start with the prompt. And really the prompt was going to be, what does hybrid look like for you? I think Lisa was on the line very early on, and she was just we were talking about, actually the idea that one of the big things about this phrase hybrid is that we've almost got to kind of try to translate it not only for our organization, but even for certain teams. And part of the immensity of this challenge is actually getting people comfortable with what hybrid is going to look like for them and for their teams and for their organizations, and the understanding that it might well change. Some of the very early sort of wisdom around hybrid is that it really seems that people's expectations have changed already from what people who've been doing hybrid for a few months now have considered it in a different way from how they expected it would be when it was set up. So I would really like to hear from you and how that would work around your own realities and your own thinking. Now, I'm having some issues getting the breakout group started. So while we're waiting for those, I think we'll do this as a hands raising exercise to start off with. In which case, what does hybrid look like for you? In your organization, in your team, with your clients that you're working with, if you're in a consultancy role, if you have any guidelines that you'd like to share or any questions that this poses for you, pop your hand up. Straight away, we have a contributor, and we'll allow you to talk and share with the group. John, over to you, sir.
Hi, Mark. Nice to see you again. For everybody else's benefit, I'm probably the person who's been using TMS for longer than anybody almost anywhere. I think the answer to your questions is it really depends. I'm thinking about client organizations, and for them, it's different for almost every organization. We've got a client who we're working with at the moment who half of their organization is basically do whatever suits you. The other half of their organization, you've got to come into the office 3 days a week. So I think one of the struggles that people are facing is getting almost a team and a sub-team level understanding of what we really mean by this and how we're going to make it work. Hope that helps.
Thank you. Absolutely, Joe. And it is, and Lisa and I were talking earlier on before we started the webinar, but it's almost a one-size-fits-one approach of allowing people to consider, you know, that it is possible to say hybrid means very different things for different organizations. Mary Frances, do you want to build on that?
Yes, please. Morning, folks. For me, it's been a learning curve from the perspective of working from home, for example. That actually is my norm, has been for a number of years. This is not new. I live in a virtual world, not to say that I don't meet real people and I come into office, etc. The greater learning point for me has been this is new for other people and they're not all loving it and liking it the way it suits me. So I've actually had to be much more appreciative of the fact that people are reacting very differently to it. Sometimes that has challenged my, let's say, tolerance levels, because there's a temptation to say, oh, for God's sake, get on with it, which is a nonsense, because everybody has their own lives and the impact, etc., etc. And when it comes back to TMS, it's fascinating because if you take the standard people's preferences for how they like to work, and what we've actually done is we've stripped away the very core of variety in terms of a typical working environment, and people have had to adjust to all sorts of things at all sorts of levels, and we wonder why people are, if not struggling, certainly having to adjust. But my hope is we take the best out of this and move forward, as opposed to dictatorial, let's all go back to the way it was, not terribly helpful. Let's all jump into, no, you only have to, hybrid means exactly that, Mark. It is hybrid for one, but remembering that people work together. So I think it's been, from a standing outside the box looking in, a fascinating, when you're in the middle of it, adaptation has been key, both personal and looking at other people. Yeah.
Thank you. And I do think, again, Fiona and I were discussing this before the session, is that, you know, we're being very conscious about labeling this at the moment, aren't we, about calling it hybrid working and saying how different this all is. Whereas in a year's time, maybe even 2 years' time, in all likelihood, it'll just be work. It'll just be working. And it might not need that label. We will have made that adjustment. Yeah. Interested to hear more about, sorry, go on.
No, I was just build on, again, linking back to our conversation earlier, Mark, and what was just said there in terms of, I think for some, this hybrid working is I appreciate we've been perhaps hybrid working for a little while for some of us, but for some people, they've been on that journey for quite some time. And for other people, this is still relatively, relatively new. And just making that point that perhaps hybrid within one organisation, but recognising that we're working with others who can be in very different stages in terms of that journey. And then, of course, it just feels a little bit like what's hybrid for me, even in my own organisation, could be very different and feel very different for someone who's in the same organisation but has a different way of working with it, if you like, in terms of how they're making that work effectively for them. That could be quite different.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the comment. Let's go to Glenn. Glenn has his hand raised. Over to you, Glenn.
Hi, Mark. Hi, everyone. Hi. I think coming from the HR world, I had an interesting conversation with someone yesterday, and I think one of the challenges that HR has faced has been all the talk of hybrid working and confusion with flexible working in terms of the very formal sense of flexible working. So there's been an education piece, certainly for certain line managers and things, to sort of understand that. But sitting on a mountainside, as Mark knows that I do a lot, having a conversation about this yesterday, which was very random. It's the no hat fits all And I think I've seen situations where the line manager is saying, okay, so the hybrid working is 3 days in, 2 days not in, and trying to, you know, create that model. And as the previous speaker just said, it's looking at it very individually. But it's been interesting from conversations I've had that it's also taken a step back. Some line managers are nervous about this and they want to help the individuals, but it's also then taking a step back and saying, but what's good for the team? And, you know, although we're all wanting to do the hybrid working and, you know, have that flexibility and so on and so forth, there's still a team cohesiveness that needs to be achieved to ultimately, sounds cliched, but, you know, achieve those organizational goals. So I've been encouraging people that I'm talking to say, yes, you're thinking about the people and helping all the hybrid, you know, and flexible types of working, but also don't forget what does the team need? And I think this is probably a question you might want to park for later in the conversation, but a great conversation yesterday about the introverts are loving this, but the extroverts are hating it. And it might be something we want to pick up on later on in the sort of thing. So, you know, lots of more introverted people are liking the staying at home, working quietly, not having all that face to face, and so on and so forth. And I'd be interested in exploring that a little bit.
Yeah. And that's if I may, just when I was talking earlier, there's almost like building on that hybrid for me, but actually me is part of the team, and there is that kind of like team aspect hybrid as well. Mark, can I just, what somebody's just mentioned in there, is it possible to put our screen into gallery so that we can see other participants, or is that just...
You should be able to do that at your end, Jane, but I've also adjusted our view, so you should be able to see a gallery sort of side-by-side view. That should be now coming across. Thank you, and thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Glenn. And we will certainly drill down into some of the preference side of things very shortly. So thank you for those. I've got a little bit of time to go to a couple more people who've got their hands raised. I'm going to go in order. So Naomi, you are next. Do feel free to contribute when you're ready.
Yep. Okay. Sorry, I had it on mute because for some reason I've not got any video. I am sitting in a car park right now, so having just had my my COVID booster and being told I wasn't allowed to drive for a few minutes. So my thought was that it was really about the link. There's something about the link between hybrid, flexibility, autonomy, and Glenn, you mentioned this, and Mary as well. There was a really good Harvard article recently that said what people are really asking for when they're using these terms, and it's a label, is they're actually asking for autonomy, they're asking for choice. And I think what COVID did was it allowed people to have a lot of autonomy in how they worked individually, and that's been mentioned a few times. And going back to work, companies are trying to put a framework around it, call it something, flexible working, hybrid, but actually what it's doing is touching the autonomy and control buttons in terms of our threat response as human beings. So that was one thought was really interesting. And linked to that, there was another article, I think it was MIT, that said if you're going to do hybrid working or a mix of in the office, let's in office and virtual, using the tools, there were 3 things that needed to be there: relatedness, autonomy, and the competency or capability to do it. And they talked about us being novice experts in the virtual world. We think we know how to do it, but perhaps we're not as expert as we think we are.
Yeah, there is that. I think I definitely can resonate with a lot of that, Naomi, that this idea that we've thought it through and we've considered the concept of it, and we'll roll it out in practice, and it probably will be exactly the same as we've conceptualized it. And people are just generally finding that's generally not the case at all. And people's experiences of hybrid in their day-to-day reality are very different from how they expected it would be. I will make sure there's an article on the curated link that we'll share afterwards, which covers that in some depth, looks at, well, what are people generally finding? What's some of the received wisdom that's coming back from organizations who are doing this in anger? Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Naomi. And if you've got a copy of that MIT article, again, let us know and we'll make sure it gets added in so that others can see that too. Thank you very much. Whoa, time for one more, I think. Jane, over to you.
Okay, even though I can see you, that's
Hey.
me that can see you.
Hey there.
What I just wanted to say was yesterday I was doing an in the room. I'm a facilitator mainly, I'm a coach supervisor these days, but I was facilitating a group who'd come into the room for the first time together. So a group that had never met together before of heads of department, but one of them was at home. So we were, it bumps into, there's an awful lot of other chatter apart from hybrid working. We're talking a lot about EDI. So it was, although we included her, she didn't give the group any choice about how, and she really wasn't given any choice about. So it depended on me being extremely flexible. Luckily I am, and that's my natural space. But it was just that sort of inequality of the experience for her. But we're trying to make it the same, but it couldn't be. And what they were all, the ones in the room were expressing was how different the conversations were because they were in the room. So it's that sort of thinking about EDI in the whole context of this. How do you include everybody?
Yeah.
And include their, apart from including their options, when there's no choice, how do you make it an inclusive experience, I suppose? I think that's quite a challenge. It's regardless of what your natural capacities are. You know, it's sometimes there's just no choice, but so it depends on the facilitator, I think, just being extremely flexible.
And I've thank you, Jane. I think we've seen this from some of the other comments in the chat box. Actually, people who've started running hybrid team events. How do you ensure that people who are in the room are getting this similar to a same experience, the people who are beaming in from a different location? It's incredibly difficult to ensure that consistency and get a sense of belonging, because that's what teamwork's all about, isn't it? It's about feeling that you belong. And if you're feeling excluded or isolated in any sense, that's going to have a knock-on effect to a sense of belonging. A real key challenge. Thank you for sharing that, Jane. Fiona, have we got anything coming in? Anything else that we haven't covered here so far in the chat?
I'm just trying to. Sorry, I'm just looking. I've got what if. But this is, I guess, a real life example of working remotely. So I've got my two screens, and I apologize if it looks like I'm looking away. I'm just kind of looking up to look at a different screen. But where is that? So flexible versus hybrid is very interesting. We have flexible working now, but we don't necessarily have all of the technology in. So someone's picking up that certain sites may not all have the same level of technology or necessarily access. So we can't assume that every site within an organization will therefore be the same. And other people picking up on what Naomi was saying and picking up on autonomy. I was just going to build on, if I may just throw one in there as well. And that last comment was just, I recently did a workshop where all of the team were in the room together and I was the virtual person. So I was not in the room with them and facilitating that workshop. And that was an interesting one to do as well, having them all together. So for that team spirit and like the example just given, they were coming together for the first time in nearly 2 years. And some of them were people that had recently been brought in, so they'd never met each other as a team, and then delivering that as well. So again, I think we're going to cover that, look into that a bit more in terms of delivery and flexibility, as was being mentioned there.
Thanks, Fiona. All right, so should we take another prompt, take another question? And I think we've started to just segue into this already with some of the comments that have been coming through already. So thank you for sharing some of those. We're interested in what have you learned so far? And you can consider this in whatever way you like. What have you learned about, your own approach when you've been working in a hybrid way so far? What have you learned from some of the articles, text, videos, podcasts you've been listening to? What's coming through for you? And also, if you're working for a business, what's the business picking up so far about hybrid working and how it's impacting on various aspects of the business? Yeah, Glenn, over to you.
I think one of the things that we've seen, certainly from, or I've seen from conversations we've had, is there isn't a right answer currently, because there are so many variations to this. So it's about digging into what's going to work for that particular location, those particular individuals, that particular business. But also, I think from conversations I'm having, it's it's exposed a level of management training and education that's required. Historically, I've worked in organizations that have been, or industries that have been quite old-fashioned in the way that they've done things. And I've seen situations where all of a sudden hybrid working starts happening, but then managers are becoming very much more hands-on, pulling through very individual bits of work and so on and so forth. And it's about how you build that trust and rely on all, you know, outputs rather than all the inputs. So there's certainly been a managerial education piece that's been pulled out.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. And any thoughts on that, on how do you build trust in a hybrid team? Anything that's come through for you so far?
Yeah, I mean, from conversations I've had, I mean, Mark, you'll know at the moment I'm not working, so these are sort of conversations that I'm having people about this generally. It's about I had a very interesting conversation, like I said yesterday, and there's very much there was a refreshed view on how objectives were being set, and fewer longer term objectives, and some of the objectives broken down into shorter term timeframes, so that meetings that managers were having remotely, you know, during the hybrid period, they were good conversations that were focusing on the outputs. And as managers have started to see the outputs happening and the business continuing to deliver, there's been less worry or concern for the managers to think, well, they're sitting at home and we don't know what they're doing. So there's been much more meaningful conversation. So the particular individual I was talking to yesterday was doing a complete refresh of their performance management system as a result of hybrid, to enable better quality conversations on a more regular basis, which was then building the trust for the managers.
Thank you. Yeah, and in a way, you know, building trust in a hybrid way versus a, you know, pre-pandemic way is still a really important aspect for teams, and actually getting to the heart of what team development is all about. It often starts with trust, and it should start with building trust. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Mark, I was going to say, Mark, just jumping in, I think certainly what I found during my short time of the hybrid working, you know, without that trust is the foundation. It's trust between the team members, it's trust of the managers, it's trust of, you know, executives of what's going on, and that has to be, I think, one of the foundations of hybrid working.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we don't have any other hands raised, but we do have some comments. Yeah, sorry, Fiona.
No, I was just going to pick up on Kate, who's just mentioned that similar, just building on what Glenn was saying there, in terms of noticing or focusing on more on shorter term objectives for annual appraisals. So if that's what is effective and going to really work for people, and also bringing up the topic of well-being here, in terms of well-being for the individual in this new way, or perhaps more established way now of working in this world. And then Naomi's picked up just on the trust element as well, picking up on that in terms of virtual and face-to-face, the different environments.
I think we're seeing, you know, and then again, on building on the trust piece, a phrase that we keep seeing coming up again and again and again. And for those of you who work in international teams, this won't be a new phrase at all, or a new concept, but for many businesses this is this idea of asynchronicity, or asynchronous teams, for teams who are used to working in real time, maybe in the same location or in a number of locations, suddenly going from that position to moving into working in very different locations and very different times, and how you address that crossover can have an impact on trust. So having a very open conversation about how we manage the gaps and how we manage the overlaps, to make sure that, you know, decisions are made effectively and that conversations happen as naturally and as consistently as they can, is also a key aspect of that. Mary Frances, did you want to mention something? on the note of what have you
Yes,
learned? What have you picked up?
I think, and it leads on from what Glenn was talking about in terms of the managers, because the more senior you are potentially, and no, it's not the case all the time, but potentially the further you are away from the coalface. So taking decisions about ways of working, etc. So engagement with teams, managers, and people within the teams about how this hybrid working is going to work to maintain team momentum, motivation, involvement, inclusion, all those good things. So the more you talk to your people, the better. And for me, there's a huge thing about letting go to do with control. I would suggest that much of you couldn't possibly do your job from home was to do with control, because if you've got folks sitting in front of you, you think you can handle performance management. And I hate to tell folk that, but folk who were lazy in the office, of course, they're going to be lazy at home and vice versa. Until you actually support and equip your line managers to work effectively with their people, then they're going to struggle anyway, but they were struggling in the office. So it's become even more important to invest in people who are managing people, because the landscape has definitely changed and people are quite right being more autonomous, as another colleague mentioned earlier in the call. And if you give people choice, if you then whip it away from them, well, guess what? How would you and I feel if all of a sudden you're told, yes, this, work from home, this is great, have a quality of life you perhaps didn't have before. So there's adjustment of thinking all the way. Sometimes I feel it's the line managers who've really been the punch bags, because they're the ones that have really had to adapt and think on their feet, sometimes with support and sometimes not. And to pick up on the HR point, policies are there as guidelines and frameworks. Well, if the framework has changed, then guess what? The policies need to be revisited and evolve. And we can't just hide behind the book says X because X used to fit. Well, it's now X and Y. So there you go. I got off my soapbox.
Thank you. And on that front, we do. I mentioned this a bit towards the end of the session. We put together a quick guide to hybrid working, which you can download after the session. Some of you may have already downloaded it. It was in one of our recent e-shots. But one of the points around that is about the fact that people are generally quite happy to change. In most cases, people adapt to change very readily. And we've seen that very dramatically over the last 18 months. What people hate is loss. Sometimes that goes hand to hand with change, but there is it gets hidden behind change aversion, whereas actually it's loss aversion. So if there's a perception of loss coming through, that is going to be something that we'll need putting on the table about if people are feeling that there's been something taken away from them, as you put, Mary Frances, that needs to be repositioned and reframed and addressed and acknowledged. Brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. We have Erling with his hand up. Erling in Bergen. Hello,
everyone.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Loud and clear.
Excellent. My point of departure regarding hybrid working model is that it is a huge organizational experiment. And therefore, I think it's really important that everyone in different organizations are monitoring very closely the effects and impacts the different solutions will have, which takes both on HR and managers perhaps a slightly different way of having attention to their own organization. One of my clients said this is the leadership challenge of the century, coming back to among others, the question around trust and how to build trust. But I think it's in Norway, with my clients, a lot of issues comes up. One of them is perhaps that continuum between, if not control, at least managing and steering versus autonomy. And how you balance out between, which seems to be a popular and common expectation among employees now, that they have more autonomy, with the necessity for an organization to manage and steer. So sounds a bit old-fashioned these days, but it's still important to the organization, whether that is related to innovation, creativity, or collaboration in general. To the point of trust, many things obviously goes into building trust. At least it needs to be viewed in a different way, as previous speakers have said already. But I think in many ways, for leaders, this change requires more of an relational skills and approaches in order to build and contain or preserve that trust. So, sort of as a paradox, people are working further away from you, but you need to keep closer to them in a way. So that would be at least one point to that question.
Thank you, Ellie. I think there is this it's a huge statement to make about vulnerability, but it's a really important one to acknowledge with teams, that we are entering into an enormous experiment, and we will treat it as an experiment. We're not going to get it right first time. It will change and it will evolve in the same way that we will evolve our thinking around this. That's certainly how we've approached it at TMS. You know, we right from the outset, we talked about this as being an experiment that we will need to review and evaluate and refine as we go along, as we get used to a new way of working, and we make it work for the team, we make it work for the business. And that was, I think that was pretty well accepted, that, you know, that idea of it being a group experiment.
Yeah. Oh, and
a hand from John. Over to you, John.
I'm quite fascinated by this, because I think one of the key things I'm noticing is that leaders, managers, whatever label you want to stick on them, are actually broad generalization, imposing their preferences on their teams, rather than actually really thinking about what are the preferences within my team.
And that is a beautiful segue. Thank you, John. It's almost as if we paid you to do this, into our third consideration around
deals on the way, Mark.
Okay, of course. Yeah, that's certainly right. That's certainly right. I thinking, getting back to TMS and the team management profile, this has been about work for 35 years. It's about how do we work and how do we want to work with each other? What do we prioritize? What do we value? What do we perceive in the way that we work? And of course, that has had to adapt around a new way of working over the last couple of years. So, you know, Glenn mentioned this earlier on, Lisa's mentioned this in the chat as well, but we are interested to know a bit more about this, about, you know, how can our understanding of a tool like the team management profile inform our working in this new way? Fiona, maybe we could come to you first, actually, before, just while we're waiting for others to think about this.
Yeah.
And because you were saying earlier on that you work with a team in a hybrid sense, and this is their team development event as well as their working practice. Yeah. How did that go? What did you learn?
Yeah, so working with the profile, so it was a bit like 2 in 1 in terms of the objectives for the team in terms of development, and some objectives of them working together in terms of learning about themselves and themselves as a team. And then it was, if you like, bolted with the fact that it had already been agreed by everyone up front that they would be returning to the office 1 day a week going forward, and the rest of the time they would all be remote. So that was the kind of the new way of agreed working. So I felt really lucky to be there, and it was very kind to be there on that very first day when they'd come back after a period of time. So working with the profile, and I must say the delivery of it was face-to-face, but of course it was in line with COVID guidelines. So it was quite a different delivery in that respect. But instantly, when I reflect back on this one, in terms of key moments that really, I think, stood out, where we spent quite a lot of time going through the models, and in particular the 4 work preference measures, but then we really spent time in on the linking aspect for people, because that was bringing forward preferences, information about each other that we could share and relate them into the work environment, but then for people to talk about those, be that in their more remote working or when they were working more with others in a, if you like, a combined environment. So we did have a lot of focus in that space, I would say, with the profile, and then bringing that back into things like virtual meetings, face-to-face meetings, and our different preferences coming through, probably initially focusing more in on the extrovert-introvert preference to start that. So those were, in terms of, it was a bit like 2 workshops in one in a way, but that was where, when that really came together, where quite a big part of our focus was for the team. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Fiona. Got a hand raised from Glenn. Over to you. Did you want to pick up on something you mentioned earlier on around kind of introversion, extroversion? Was the point I think you were picking up on? I'll pop up on screen.
Yeah, I think again, just picking up on the points made previous as well. I was asked a number of years ago a question when I was managing a team and what have you. And I think it's become a key question in some of the conversations that I've had recently around this area, and particularly to the line managers, is how well do you know your team? And I know historically I've had conversations with the line managers and they'll say, well, you know, Joe Bloggs does this for me, and, you know, Gillian does this for me, or whatever. And it's just like, yes, but how well do you know them? And now that we're in this new world, whatever this new world is with the hybrid, and I still believe everyone is still finding their feet, and there's still a lot to be learned. We know what jobs they're doing, but again, the question is, well, how well do you know your team? There's a lot more to that. So that whole thing about, as I mentioned before, you know, comments people have made about, well, the introverts have loved this and the extroverts have hated it. It was interesting for me when I first moved into the COVID way of working, to use that phrase. I always thought I'd love working from home 5 days a week and having that flexibility and things like that. And very quickly, I missed that social interaction and that face-to-face, and suddenly realized that for me, there needed to be some balance. And you know, there's just been that key question: how well do you know your team? And it's not about what jobs your people are doing. Like I said, it's their wellness, it's their personality, and so on and so forth. So I think that's been a really key question for me recently, about getting to grips with more effective hybrid working for managers dealing with it.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing, Glenn.
And that's linking back to something Kate was picking up on earlier, I think, in terms of the chat when she was talking in her note around well-being.
Yes.
Just when you're picking up there, Glenn, on wellness and well-being of the individual. Yeah.
We have a hand raised from Lucy. Over to you, Lucy.
Yes, I was just going to build on that point that had just been mentioned about introverts. Throughout COVID, I'm normally freelance. I normally work from home. Throughout COVID, I actually had a part-time job within the NHS. I know I'm on the introvert scale, and a lot of that remote working I loved, but I soon realised that it disadvantaged me in a way, because I found it harder to overtly reach out to people and have conversations than I would have done had I been physically in the office with them. So I think it's quite complex. So whilst I had loads of time to reflect, I didn't get so tired because I wasn't inundated with people around me all the time. I found it harder to actually think, okay, I need to speak to such and such person today. I'll just put it off a bit because I don't really feel like doing it. Whereas if you're actually in the same building as somebody, it forces you out of your shell a little bit, to use a pretty primitive expression. But so I think it's looking at individuals and not just think, sorry, dog, and not just thinking that because they're introvert, it's going to suit them. It's exactly as Glenn was saying, how well do you know your individuals, and how does that introversy come out in their behaviour, and what help might they need to overcome that and play to their strengths.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Lucy. And I think is a wonderful example of us not leaning too far into some of this, I think, and making any too many sweeping generalizations about what could be going on here, who could do well, who could thrive in certain environments. I will post a link to an article in the curation which actually looked at resilience during the pandemic with exclusive remote working, and they found that there were very few predictors on a sort of personality level of resilience. In fact, the only possible predictor that the study found was neuroticism. Actually, high levels of neuroticism led to sort of low resilience throughout the pandemic, and that was pretty reasonably measured. The sort of measures that we see here in the team management profile, yes, there will be different needs and wants, and that comes through in slightly different ways in a remote environment, in a hybrid environment. And the best way to find out is to ask people and look for patterns and themes, absolutely. But again, it will differ based on the strength of some of these scores and the strength of certain preferences, the combinations of preferences. It will come through differently, as Lucy articulated beautifully there. It was lovely to hear from your dog. Absolutely no need to apologise at all.
Kate, I'm just conscious I mentioned Kate and well-being, and is it all right just to pick up on Kate, because I can see your hands up?
Yeah, over to you, Kate.
Yeah, thank you both. It wasn't actually so much that, but I'm quite interested, and I'm wondering if you're going to come on to this about, it feels like the obvious one to look at in terms of the preferences, the introversion, extroversion, but I'm wondering how, how far you are on the creative or practical scale, how much that might play into it and your decision making, and particularly, I guess, the organisation kind of pairing as well.
Yeah, so in terms of the other work preference measures.
Because it feels like there's lots of discussion of people, making, like, it was really interesting what Lucy was saying, it's not as cut and dried in terms of introversion and extroversion, even though I'm sure that plays a massive part. But I'm starting to wonder if you're really far down the creative scale, that makes it harder not to interact with people. And then perhaps if people are more on the, on the practical side of things, they don't mind as much not having the interaction. But again, I don't know whether I'm making assumptions now.
Mark, do you have any thoughts on that in terms of the other scales? I mean, I guess each time it's unique to the individual, of course, but just wondering in terms of, Kate was saying there.
I'd probably gently challenge that and say, you're probably more likely to see that come out on the fourth scale, around structured and flexible. I think some of those ideas of, I hear where you're coming from, Kate, and there's an element of the practical preference which is about the tried and tested, and about the tangible and the real, and working with all of that. But when it comes to actually expectations and looking at existing processes and systems and structures that have been well established and making sure they're set up, changing those and flexing those and considering very different styles. If we're talking about even, the notion of a working day, a 9 to 5 versus a, 8 to 10 to a 10 to 4 and a 6 till 10 p.m. day, that might be more of a challenge for somebody with a structured preference, an embedded structured preference to consider than compared to somebody with a more flexible approach who might already be working in that way, for example. But I think there's certainly an argument to say you could look at each and every one of these dimensions and consider, how is this likely to bring itself to a hybrid environment? What sort of behaviours are we likely to see? What sort of needs and wants are we likely to see? And that's probably a good starting point for having a team consider this. What do we want hybrid to look like for us?
Yeah, and I think it just reinforces, doesn't it, the whole idea of we're all really individual, and I think it's to do with how you like to work and your preferences, your family circumstances, all sorts of things. And each of those, if you think of all the different variations there are of the report, and then add into all the other things into the mix, then it just shows how individual everybody is, doesn't it? And that you can't really make assumptions. But like several people have said, that's what's so important, is asking the questions, isn't it? Having the conversations with people about what's working for them, what's not, what might be different that would enable them to be more productive or have better well-being, whatever it might be.
And if anyone wants a gold star award, if you can remember how many variations of the report there are, pop that into the chat box, and the first person to put the correct number will get a gold star from Fiona and I. Thank you, Kate. Elke, over to you. I know you've had your hand raised for a little while.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on the introvert part of the discussion. I think it's also a challenge for the introverts to be aware, not to become invisible within the team, because in whatever virtual meetings, the extroverts normally speak up while the introverts are listening, and then continue managing their work quietly from home, which might have really a career impact in the end, because their manager or the rest of the team or the manager's manager don't see them anymore. They may see they are working, they are spending time, but they are not visible for them anymore.
Yeah, thank you, Elke. So it is about, yeah, it can be about visibility. And how is visibility perceived by different preferences? We haven't got the right number. Oh, we have got the right number. Sue O'Boyle, of course, gets the gold star. Sue used to, for those who don't know, Sue actually used to work with TMSDI. She used to be one of our learning development consultants. So I'd have been very disappointed if it was the wrong number. So yeah, if anyone wants to walk away with at least one fact, when you're giving out the profiles, the profile that somebody has in front of them is one of 208 possible permutations. So yeah, it goes into quite some depth. But thank you for posting that, and thank you for the other guesses as well. 200 and something will do, Kate. Yeah, and Lisa, yeah, yes, you were close. Wonderful. Oh, we're almost at time. We've just got time for a couple more comments, so we'll go with Lisa and back to Glenn. So Lisa, over to you.
Hi, everybody. I kind of wanted to pick up on the point about creativity. I love this part. Really enjoying this part of the discussion. I've been working in a hybrid way for many years, but now my clients are all doing it much more as well. But I do have creativity as a preference, and this year I have actually met somebody online. We've actually started a new business and we've created an actual product, designed a product. So we've really expressed our creativity, even working virtually. And I think what our need has just been around, it's been around having space to do that, but it's a lot of it has been about trust. And the trust to kind of express yourself and feel that you're safe has been really useful. And kind of also building on the comment about trust. So I was yesterday delivered a hybrid event where I had the majority of the people in the room for the first time, and there were 8 people online. It was very difficult to do without professional audio-visual support to make sure that you were being fully inclusive for people who were online. So anybody who attempts that, I do recommend that you grab as much tech support as you can to help make that a good experience for everybody. But the one thing that came up again in that event was about trust, and the leader had asked me, how do we compare to other similar teams? Is our profile the same or different? And I said, well, actually, you're not that different from other teams doing the same thing that you do. But we had this, we then had kind of this big moment of realization that the thing that was different was the level of trust in this team versus similar teams in the same organization. And that's not necessarily something that TMSDI profile measures, but it is kind of worthwhile kind of looking at what alternative mechanisms you can use to gauge the depth of trust in a team when you're working with them on their effectiveness, I think.
Yeah, Super. Thank you, Lisa. And for those of you who were on Joe Cook's webinar last year about the virtual working and practices for virtual working, she did talk about having a producer and thinking about, you know, a hybrid event as a production of sorts, and sort of recruiting in somebody to do the production side so that you can turn up and just be brilliant and not have to worry about pressing the buttons and making sure the cameras are pointing in the right place. Yeah, Mary Frances has also agreed with that. Yeah, tech backup essential, very much so. All right, we've got a question from Colin, and we'll go to Glenn one more time before we start to wrap up. So Glenn, over to you, sir, on this note.
Yeah, I just want, well, particularly picking up on the point you were making before, Mark, about the structured and flexible and how that sort of comes out. I think the first comment I'd make is it still goes to show how powerful the TMS tool is in terms of helping us facilitate these sort of conversations. But I think another thing that I found where we've talked about trust is on the structured and flexible, you know, you've had teams where all of a sudden people are really shocked when they found out one of the team has gone out for a run at 11 o'clock in the morning, or someone's, you know, done a school run in the afternoon and things like that. And one of the things that I found I've had discussions around is we've talked about preferences and things like that, but the conversations to help build the trust and look at almost the new model of trust is talking about a team charter. And there's been some great conversations where, you know, you've looked at the team, you've talked about preferences and things like that, but then gone back and said, okay, so how does this team want to work? What are the new, almost, you know, charter and values of that team? Because if we're truly hybrid working and someone wants to go for a run at 11 o'clock for half an hour and that works for them, but they're still getting the outputs done. So it's, for me, it's been pulling back, you know, some of the individual preferences and things like that, and then revisiting so what are the team's values? What's your charter? How are you wanting to work? So that we can take account of all the individual preferences and the wants for the hybrid working, but still maintain, you know, that trust in the team. And so that people understand, like I said, if someone does want to go for a run, that's fine. But the work needs to still be done so that the organisation is still delivering. So there's been a lot more chat about the team charters and team cohesiveness around some of those values.
Yeah, I love that, Glenn. And I think a lot of that comes back to boundaries, isn't it? You know, we're talking about redefining boundaries that were there pre-pandemic, and then considering what those boundaries look like now, whether they're about well-being boundaries, whether about their work-life shift boundaries, or, you know, in the middle of the day, if someone wants to go for a run, is that acceptable, and is that considered a breaking a boundary of any kind? Can we talk about that openly and honestly? I think that's a really good practice to get into, and of course you can draw on some of the learning and the language from the profile to do that. Thank you for sharing. We have a question here, Colin, and I wanted to maybe come to Fiona for a take on this before we start to wrap up. Colin has asked, very controversially I might add, would a split wheel individual potentially adapt more easily to a hybrid environment? Fiona, have you got any initial thoughts on that? What do you think about, would a split wheel profile individual potentially adapt more easily to a hybrid environment?
So it makes me think, so instantly split wheel, I conjure up the wheel with the gaps in between, whether that's a two-way or a three-way split. And in terms of where those preferences are pulling us, we know that rather than being clustered together in the same area or parts of the wheel, we have got these diverse pools in terms of the preferences. I think so when you think of it, when I think of it like that, in terms of the messaging around being pulled in the different areas, I think at that high level, perhaps first of all, one might think, well, yes, the preferences are perhaps covering more areas of this aspect. But I think this really comes back to something that Kate was asking earlier, and us also thinking about the fact that there are these 208 different versions of the profile. Because when I think about the split wheel and the 4 work preference measures there that are overlaid when the models combine, that applies to all 4 scales. It's not a case of one of the scales. And I know we've talked a lot today about the all 4, but the extrovert, introvert, and structured flexible. So I think it would it would be really dependent on, of course, the individual's unique results and looking perhaps at those 4 scales and then how those have come together for them. So I don't think it is a one answer would fit appropriately for this. I think we would be curious to obviously work with that profile and with that report. So I don't feel that there is a yes or a no on this. I think it starts with the fact that the preferences are pulling us in different parts, but then to explore that more with the individual, and also some of the differences, the opportunities, what are the triggers for the individual in terms of their split wheel, because when we think about working remotely versus working in the office, some of those triggers could be really different, of course.
Thank you.
Over to you, Mark.
I would absolutely agree, and I think it feels like a cop-out, and I hope it doesn't sound like one, Colin, but it depends on the hybrid environment, and it depends on the split wheel, as opposed to, you know, whether it will be an easy adaptation or a more difficult adaptation. So yes, definitely go, rather than stick with the sort of helicopter view of, you know, split wheels tend to be more adaptable. Look at the environment, look at the context first, then look at the particular split and how that breaks down, and that will probably give you some greater clues. Right, gosh, goodness me, hasn't that time flown? And we could carry on talking about this for another hour, I'm sure. But we do have we did say that it will be an hour. So before we start to wrap up, thank you so much to everybody for your generosity in the chat function. For those of you who came on to talk to us over the microphones, we really, really appreciate it. And gosh, aren't we lucky to have such a generous network to share some of these challenges with. For those of you who are interested, we did actually write up a quick guide to hybrid working. You can download that via the link that will come through after the webinar. There'll be a thank you link that'll come through, and you can get to that there. If you haven't already seen it from our marketing team, there's sort of 10 tips that we've written up, things to be thinking about, some language to be using with groups. Likewise, for those of you who are interested in getting into anything that we're offering, we are still offering webinar accreditation. We've got a brand new online accreditation that you can do at your own pace, and some customized in-house accreditation. Sue mentioned in the chat, there's a great tool called the Opportunity Orientation Profile, which gets into things like resilience and multi-pathways and creative approaches to obstacles when they occur. And this really does tie in nicely to a lot of the conversations that we've been having so far. But in the meantime, once again, a very huge thank you as well to my partner in crime today, Fiona, for helping to manage what has been a really interesting set of discussions and sharing. We'll also, of course, put that curation link together, and that will be shared with everybody in due course. Meanwhile, enjoy the rest of your week and your Decembers as they're ahead. Stay safe, stay well, and we'll look forward to hearing you all in due course. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.